we go to the extreme and say that we have a metaphor, and yet the vehicle and the tenor are not mentioned, but they are rather hinted at. So the reader is the one who is supposed to decode the figure of speech and to find out the kind of the kind of vehicle and the kind of tenor that were used. And Shakespeare is really a master of metaphors. Shakespeare can provide his readers with metaphors where the tenor and the vehicle are implied and not explicitly shown to the readers. So let us read these 4 lines. That time of year thou mayest in me behold, when yellow leaves, or none, or few do hang upon those boughs which shake against the cold, bare ruined choirs where late the sweet birds sang. That time of year, you know, the year has 4 seasons, but he doesn't mention the season. He mentioned things associated with the season. Thou mayest in me behold, when yellow leaves, yellow leaves. Yellow leaves prove that we are talking about autumn, or let us say late fall, when the trees start to shed their leaves. So the trees will have yellow leaves, or none, that is, no leaves at all, or few leaves do hang upon the branches of the trees. So then, okay, so here the poet left a clue for us. What time of the year is Shakespeare talking about? Indeed, it is what? It's fall, when the trees start to shed their leaves. Okay, so in me behold, what is Shakespeare hinting at? Shakespeare here is trying to liken something to something. He likens old age to late fall. Old age to late fall. So old age is the tenor, and the vehicle is late fall. Well, it's fabulous. Shakespeare is saying that we can behold. We can behold, and behold is a word that was used in Shakespeare's time to mean see. Like if I want to tell you something like look, I might say behold. So the time of year thou mayest in me behold, you can see that time of the year in me, when yellow leaves or none do hang. So the human being is similar to autumn. What happens during autumn? Well, trees shed their leaves. Trees become bare. They have no leaves, they have no fruits. And the philosophical question here is, human beings, do we as human beings shed anything like trees? I think this reminds me of what Shakespeare said in his play As You Like It, when he was talking about the 7 ages of man. he mentions something like, if my memory helps me, something like sans teeth, sans taste, and sans means without. So the human being becomes without teeth. So this is again shedding. So the human being sheds his teeth. What do we also shed? Well, I think we shed our hair, and we shed our skin. So is it possible that the cycle of nature manifests itself in the human being? Obviously, there is enough evidence that the answer is yes. As we grow older, we shed teeth, we shed hair, and we shed skin. So if we want to see autumn in the human being, I think we can. So notice the depth of the metaphor that Shakespeare is using. Shakespeare is telling us that you can see all the natural phenomena in the human being. So the human being passes through cycles and seasons. When we are young, we are living our summer and our spring. And when we are old, we are living our fall and then our winter, as we have it in As You Like It, when he calls it the last scene of all, which is death. Now, the branches of the trees shake against the cold. Do old people shake against the cold? Yes, they do. And coldness here could be something physical because of the physical or the physiological traits of the old people. They can easily get cold. They don't have the hot blood of youth, so to speak. And also they experience the emotional coldness. They are no longer burning with emotions. And probably it could be a reference to their cold responses to life in general. So yes, old people can shake against the cold, exactly like trees shake under the power of cold weather. Then Shakespeare continues by saying, bare ruined choirs where late the sweet birds sang. Now what happens to the birds which used to sing upon the branches of the trees? Well, when fall arrives, trees are abandoned by the birds. The birds have to immigrate. They have to move to a warm place. So if birds do not leave the cold areas, they feel cold. But some of them are late for this kind of moving to another place. So you can see some of them singing, but what kind of birds? They are only the late birds. Can we see something which is really deep here? Is it possible that there is also a kind of analogy between the situation of the old people and the situation of the late birds? I hope that I am not carrying the metaphor too far, but I cannot help but think that human beings can also be late birds. How? Probably you can write to me in your comments how. For me, it could be like when a person is old and his generation of old people all died. Doesn't he feel like a late bird waiting for his death? Tell me if you agree with that or not in your comments. on the page after I post the video. So in this sonnet, I noticed that Shakespeare used a very successful metaphor. And the effectiveness and the depth of his metaphor is clear in his choice of tenor and vehicle. Shakespeare here used an implied metaphor where he did not mention the tenor or the vehicle, but he mentioned things which are closely associated with the vehicle. Yellow leaves, cold weather, late birds are associated with fall or autumn. And the use of in me behold is a reference to the human being. Okay. Another good example would be an example from I think it's Robert Burns, yes. From Robert Burns, A Red, Red Rose. It's a very famous poem. And it was a song also by Catherine Madison. The poet says, "And I will love thee still, my dear, while the sands of life shall run." Now again, this kind of simple metaphor is indeed very effective if you think about it, because the poet does not mention directly the thing that he wants to say. He employed what we might call an implied comparison between life and something else. We have life in the poem, but there is a reference to sands. So life is the tenor. So where is the vehicle? Where is the vehicle? He compares between life and something else. What is the thing that relates to time and relates to sands? I hope that as you are listening to me right now, your eyes will sparkle with the answer, and you will say to me, yes, hourglass. In the past, we refer to the hourglass where we have sand. We have two parts, the upper part and the lower part. So when the sand moves from the upper part to the lower part, time passes. If sand is over, then an hour passed or so. So the poet here likens life to an hourglass. While the sands run, that is, while life remains, the lover will love his beloved. So as you can see, the poet, through the use of this metaphor, was able to create an image as we imagine the hourglass and the sand. And he was also able to turn the abstract thing into a concrete thing. Love is one of the abstract nouns. So the poet was able to change the abstract into something concrete through the use of the visual image and the implied metaphor that we have here. So the poet here, it tries to say something to his beloved. And dear students, I want to draw your attention to the fact that poets use similes, metaphors, and figures of speech in general to communicate a message. So what's the function of this kind of metaphor? Actually, the poet, as you can feel, it tries to say to his beloved that he will love her for the rest of his life. He will remain faithful to her. He is not going to be fickle. because, you know, fickleness of lovers is often a very important theme in poetry. So he says, as long as life exists, I'm going to continue loving you. So this is a very successful employment of what we call an implied metaphor, where the similarity is hinted at. Okay, so this is the end of our lecture for today about using specific examples of similes and metaphors. And I hope that the third lecture will include a study of a poem which is all based on a metaphor, to see how a poem can communicate its message through the use of metaphor and its function. So, after having discussed individual examples of metaphors taken from different poems by great writers, we will move right now to take an example of a poem which is based on a metaphor from its beginning to its end. That is, the poet communicated the message through using a metaphor. The poem that we are going to choose today is Emily Dickinson's poem, Hope is the Thing with Feathers. I think it's not the first time that you hear the name of Emily Dickinson. Emily Dickinson is one of the most famous American female writers who dedicated her entire life to writing poetry. Today, after having recognized Emily Dickinson, people consider her as one of the top 5 of female poets. Emily Dickinson lived in a period of time where not many rights were given to women, and therefore Emily was not happy with what society offered women in her own lifetime. Emily Dickinson also had a troublesome life with her father. She didn't like her father, actually, and this developed a sort of complex in her. Emily Dickinson was able to publish like half a dozen of poems during her lifetime. But the fact that Emily Dickinson spent all her life writing poetry, and some people say she locked herself up in her room and spent most of her time writing poetry, proves that she believed in the significance of what she was doing. Oddly enough, I once read that Emily Dickinson asked her sister to burn her poems after her death. But fortunately, her sister did not burn any of these poems, but she rather published them. And after she published them, Emily Dickinson became a very famous poet. And everybody reads her poems right now. And probably, if you recall some memories of our discussions in class, you remember some of the quotes that we had from Emily Dickinson's poems. Even though Emily Dickinson's life was not perfect, but she wrote poems that incite the readers to feel hopeful and to see the bright side of life. The poem that I have today is a good example. Let us first start by looking at the title. I think the title is worth attention. Hope is the thing with feathers. Obviously, hope is the tenor. And I shall always remind you that a metaphor has a tenor and a vehicle. Now, the poet did not mention a vehicle, but mentioned something associated with the vehicle. The poet here mentioned thing with feathers. Feathers. I think the key word here is feathers. Now, what occurs to your mind as I mention feathers? I wish I were in class and I could see you smiling and saying bird. Actually, feathers are associated with birds. And the ability of the bird to fly is one of the most important things that human beings have always dreamt of. And that's why we have such attempts to fly by human beings before even the invention of the aeroplanes. So yes, feathers. So let us read the poem and try to discover the clues that the poet left for us to emphasize that the vehicle is bird. The poet says, "Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. And the sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could abase the little bird that kept so many warm. I've heard it in the chilliest land and on the strangest sea, yet never in extremity it asked a crumb of me." So probably, as you can see when you look at page 58, the poem is divided into 3 stanzas. And actually, Emily Dickinson is famous for using this kind of stanza, which is the quatrain. And if you look at your books right now, you will see that Emily Dickinson prefers this kind of rhyme. Feathers, A, soul, B, words, A, and all is B. A, B, A, B. And in some other cases, Emily Dickinson would use A, B, C, B. But in this stanza, the first one and the second one, we notice the use of A, B, A, B. So she uses a quatrain which rhymes A, B, A, B. Now let us take the first quatrain. Hope is the thing with feathers. We notice that the title is exactly the same as line number 1. Then if we move to line 2, that perches in the soul. Are you familiar with the verb perch? P-E-R-C-H. Perch is something that is associated with birds. Perches. But where does it perch? In the soul. Usually the bird perches in the nest, but here it perches in the soul. So another keyword in addition to feathers, now we have the word perches. And number 3, we have and sings. Birds sing. So now we have 3 words which help us discover what kind of vehicle the poet means. Feathers, perches, and sings. These 3 words together emphasize that the vehicle is bird. It's bird, yeah. So Emily Dickinson likens hope to a bird. What could be the similarity between hope and bird? Both birds and hope are free. No one can stop you when you want to be hopeful. I think people can be imprisoned by others, physically I mean. But can anyone imprison hope? The answer is absolutely no. No one can imprison hope, because hope is something that is as free as a bird, as free as a bird. Sings the tune without the words. Usually when you think of singing, you think of the words of the song, but birds sing without words and never stops at all. So if no one can stop a bird from singing, then no one can stop a human being from being hopeful, which means that hope for the human being is like singing for a bird. Both are significant and life-sustaining. Without hope, our hearts would break. Similarly, without wings, birds will never fly. So if the bird is free because of feathers, then the human being is free because of hope. The idea is pursued in the second stanza. Now, when do we need hope? And the sweetest in the gale is heard. Gale here means something like storm. And sore must be the storm that could abase the little bird. Now, is hope needed in specific places and not needed in other places? It's a question for you. Birds could keep their silence during a storm. They don't sing. Probably they don't fly. But does this mean that birds do not need their singing or their wings? Absolutely no. Hope is needed anytime and needed anywhere. And actually, if hope is needed, it is needed in the most difficult times. So it is possible that the poet here is hinting at another kind of metaphor where storms represent difficulties. So difficulties of life are like storms. And when we face difficulties, we need hope. And when the bird is in a storm, the bird needs to entertain itself by singing. So the little bird is kept warm by its feathers, and the human being is kept warm by being hopeful. So hope is needed in the most difficult times. In the third stanza, the poet says, I've heard it in the chilliest land. In the chilliest land. And chilly relates to cold weather. And actually, if we think about this kind of unpleasant weather, we can always say that hope is needed in the pleasant places and in the unpleasant places, during times of ease and during times of difficulties. So we have to notice that hope is needed anytime, and it is needed anywhere. It's not only needed by the rich people or the poor people. It's not only needed in the, let us say, developed countries and not needed in the developing countries. It is needed by both those who live a comfortable life and those who live a desperate life. And you can see here the richness of the poem, that every word is put in its right place, and every word suggests plenty of meanings. Now, what do we really offer when we are hopeful? We offer life. We offer optimism. But the question is, do we lose anything? Do we lose anything when we are hopeful? Do we need to, let us say, pay a price for being hopeful? The question is indeed no. I think you disagree with me. No one loses anything if he or she is hopeful. And this is exactly what Emily Dickinson tries to say almost in every line of her poem. So she says that she could hear hope, which is associated with singing here, in the chilliest land and on the strangest sea. All over the world, hope is needed, no matter whether we know the place or we don't know the place. Yet, and in poetry, every word is important. Yet shows you contrast. Yet never in extremity it asked a crumb of me. Did hope ever ask for a crumb as a payment? The question is answered by saying no. Now, why do you think the poet used crumb? And the crumb is C-R-U-M-B. Actually, if you think about it, I think this word should be added to our list of the words which make the vehicle very clear. We mentioned feathers, we mentioned perches, we mentioned things, and now we can add crumb, a crumb. So 4 words are associated with birds. Usually, if we think of crumb is like when you have pieces of bread given to a bird. Does hope require you to pay anything, even a crumb? And here is a difference that we notice between a bird and hope. For the bird to sing and to be happy, I think the bird should be fed. The bird needs some food to eat. You can give some crumbs to birds. But do we need to feed hope? Hope is something which is inside every one of us. And there is no need for hope to be fed or to be rewarded. Hope is something that exists in us and does not require anything of us. So, what is the poet trying to say? What's the basic theme of the poem? Please write in your comments. Write to me the major theme of the poem. But for me, I can tell you that the poem gave me a surge of energy to be hopeful and to think that hope is something which is precious and hopeful. And how was that achieved? It's through the successful use of metaphor, the thing which proves that simile and metaphor are the most basic and the most widely used figures of speech that can help us communicate our messages effectively. I hope that I was able to communicate the meaning of simile and the meaning of metaphor to you through these different quotes from different great writers. And I hope that your study of the simile in Langston Hughes's poem and the metaphor in Emily Dickinson's poem were very useful, and you were able to understand the meaning. I will not go back to this again in the fourth lecture. I think I will move to talk about other figures of speech like synecdoche, metonymy, hyperbole, and other figures of speech. So thank you for being attentive and patient with me. See you next time, inshallah, with our 4th lecture about other figures of speech. Thank you and keep safe.